Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is Week 6, Pride and Prejudice, and Pride and Prejudice, and Pride and Prejudice, and Zombies.
Oh my.
This rolls right off the tongue. It's
right?
Easy.
We like to keep our titles succinct here.
Right. So, happy Valentine's Day, everyone. This episode should be coming out on February 14th. And so we're getting a little sappy this week with, you guessed it, Pride and Prejudice.
Right. Happy Valentine's Day to all of our listeners out there. Thank you for tuning in and joining us today, and we hope you enjoy our tales of romance, or our singular tale of romance today,
right?
Told in many different ways.
Like the most different ways that we could possibly find.
Right, we got really into it this week. I was not expecting to get this into the Pride and Prejudice week, but we watched a lot of stuff.
Yeah, so I had been familiar with the story before and several of these renditions, but Alex, you are completely new to this story, fresh this week.
Right. I had no experience with it. All I knew had come from either friends talking about it or the stray GIF on Tumblr from the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. But other than that, I knew nothing. And I know we both actually listened to the audiobook this week as well.
So we're familiar with the source material.
Right. And we'll go over that here before we even dive into the movies themselves. But we also watched our 3 movies proper this week, as well as some other imitations. But we'll get into that later. Yeah,
this is a movie podcast, but we will kind of direct you to some further watching if you're interested at the end.
Right. Because if you are a Pride and Prejudice fan, you're in luck. There's a lot of you. There's a lot of us, I should say, out there. And it's been made a lot of times.
Yes, very many.
So anyway, let's talk about the source material itself. If you don't know, Pride and Prejudice is a novel that was written by Jane Austen in 1813, or it was at least published in 1813. And Jane Austen was a fantastic author, born in 1775, lived to 1817. She lived in England under the Regency. So we have a lot of that culture present in her books, and that plays a very large part in Pride and Prejudice itself.
Yep, she's known for, of course, this book and several others such as Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, Emma, lots of stuff. Very accomplished for a woman of her time. And as we learned in the story, there are lots of young, accomplished women. Right, Alex?
Right. Well, if you look at what really makes an accomplished woman, there's not really that many out there.
Maybe half a dozen?
If you're lucky.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just kind of talk over the plot. And we figure there's no spoilers on 19th century literature. If it's been around for over a century, then you had your chance to avoid spoilers.
Right.
So we're just going to go over the basic points of the whole plot so that as we get to each of these movies, we don't have to go over the story again, and we can just talk about how they approach different aspects and what they changed or added.
It's a bit cliche, but the book is always better. It's always the best. But it's fascinating to see the different ways you can translate that into a visual medium, especially film. But anyway, let's talk about our characters. So the story centers around the Bennet family, which has 5 sisters: Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. That's in order from oldest to youngest. Jane is the nicest of the daughters. Elizabeth is our protagonist and narrator. Mary is the smartest and also the most shy. And Kitty and Lydia are the most outgoing, flirtatious, and reckless
foolhardy
of the 5.
Yeah, so they also have a mother who is has how do we put it?
She is completely obsessed
Yeah,
with marrying off
yeah.
her daughters.
Yes, very obsessed with marrying off her daughters. She gets flustered and hysterical at every little thing that goes wrong in her life and drives their father, Mr. Bennet, totally crazy. And he takes solace by reading in his study as much as he can, and he likes Elizabeth the best. So they definitely have a special relationship and an understanding together that's kind of unique out of the sisters.
Right. And everything gets shaken up by the arrival of Mr. Bingley, a young and rich and single man who just moved into the country neighborhood. And Mrs. Bennet, the mother, is completely convinced that she needs to marry off at least one of her daughters to Mr. Bingley.
So there's a party, and I don't remember actually who hosts the party. I don't know if it matters.
It seems to be some sort of community ball held regularly. But Mr. Bingley, his arrival, and the friends he brought were definitely the main news of the night.
Right, so that's where Mr. Bingley and his friend, Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Bingley's sister, Caroline,
Right.
all get introduced to the people in the community. So we get to learn about them here too. So Mr. Bingley is very affable, kind of warm-hearted and generous, and just loves meeting people and talking with people. And his friend, Mr. Darcy, seems quite different. He is quiet and judgmental, kind of looks down his nose at everybody. He thinks that this country community is kind of beneath him, or at least that's the vibe that we get from him during this first impression.
Right, he's very cold and distant. His friend Mr. Bingley is very warm and open. Mr. Bingley and Jane fall in like very quickly, basically immediately. They dance multiple times throughout the night. There's a lot of talk about how they dance together most of the night. However, Darcy has a bit of a run-in with the second oldest sister, Elizabeth. That doesn't go so well. Bingley,
well, not so much of a run-in as Elizabeth overhears a conversation between Bingley and Darcy in which Darcy says some somewhat disparaging comments against Elizabeth and really everyone in the room. So Elizabeth, right off the bat, knows that Darcy does not like her, and so she, right off the bat, does not like Darcy.
Right, so everything's off on a bad foot for Darcy and Elizabeth. Everything's off on a great foot for Jane and Bingley.
Okay, so a couple days later, Jane gets a note from the Bingleys to invite her over to tea. However, this is a note from Bingley's sister, Caroline, and Bingley himself will not actually be there. So Mrs. Bennet decides to have Jane ride over on horseback because she sees that it's going to rain and she won't be able to ride back in all the mud, so she'll have to stay over the night until Mr. Bingley is there so that they can have more interaction and hopefully kickstart them towards an engagement.
Right. The only problem is the plan works a little too well. And Jane ends up getting sick and having to stay for quite a long time over at Mr. Bingley's house. And then Elizabeth ends up coming over as well in the next few days, upon hearing that Jane is sick, to keep her favorite sister company. However, she's forced into the company of Darcy as well, who's staying with his friend Mr. Bingley.
Yeah, and at this point, Elizabeth finds more things to not like about Darcy. However, Darcy finds that he's actually somewhat attracted to Elizabeth at this point. Very subtly, but we find that out later.
Right. We also start to see that Caroline, Mr. Bingley's sister, is also attracted to Darcy and definitely has designs upon his hand in marriage.
Right. So once she notices that Darcy is attracted to Elizabeth, it becomes kind of a jealous rivalry, but very underplayed.
Correct.
So fast forward a few days, Jane and Elizabeth are back home, and we find out that a new person is coming over to dinner at the Bennets, a Mr. Collins. Oh boy.
Yeah. So Mr. Collins is a very interesting character. He is a cousin to the Bennets. He is also the man who is designated to inherit the Bennets' house, since the Bennets have no male heir. So if Mr. Bennet dies, all of the Bennet sisters could easily be out on their bums while Mr. Collins claims the house. So Mr. Collins comes to dinner with the idea that he will marry one of those sisters in order to keep the house in the family and secure the house for their future, as well as securing a wife for himself, as instructed by his wonderful patroness, the Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
So Mr. Collins is a preacher, and so he doesn't make a big living. He has a patroness who provides for him pretty much everything that he has, and he feels an overwhelming debt of gratitude to her at all times, which becomes quite annoying to especially Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet, and they find it kind of hilarious, actually, how obsessed he is with her.
So pretty soon after Mr. Collins arrives in town, another character enters our story, a young new lieutenant by the name of George Wickham. I don't like Wickham. Anyway.
Yeah, no one does.
No one likes Wickham.
Except for, well...
Right.
Actually, at the beginning, we do like Wickham. Wickham is charming. He's very outgoing, and he charms the pants off all the sisters, basically. And Elizabeth really likes him, likes talking with him, and so they have some interactions. At some point while they're talking in town, Darcy and Bingley ride up, and there are some glances exchanged between Wickham and Darcy, and Elizabeth catches on that there's some history there, and it is not altogether pleasant. Darcy leaves without really saying anything, so she questions Wickham about what's going on, and Wickham tells her this story about how Darcy cheated her out of an inheritance and stuff like that. So Elizabeth now really doesn't like Darcy.
Soon after this, at the urging of some of the younger Bennet sisters, Mr. Bingley decides to hold his own ball.
A lot of stuff happens in this ball. Darcy is paying pretty close attention to the Bennets because he notices the attraction between Jane and his friend Mr. Bingley. So he notices the younger sisters being quite rambunctious, and the mother kind of exclaiming her intent for all of her daughters to be married rich and well off. And meanwhile, he starts to develop a fancy for Elizabeth and actually asks her to dance at some point. Tracking forward a bit, back at the Bennet residence, Mr. Collins is now trying to decide which of the Bennet sisters he would like to marry, and originally casts his gaze upon Jane, the oldest.
However, as Mrs. Bennet loves to brag to anyone within earshot, Jane is soon to be married or soon to be engaged even. She's not even engaged yet, to a very rich man, hint, hint to Mr. Bingley.
Which nothing has actually led to that conclusion, but she will spread it to anyone who will listen.
Right, right, and remember that. But, however, she informs him that Elizabeth's hand is not spoken for yet. So Collins does the only logical thing and proposes to Elizabeth,
who, in no uncertain terms, turns him down. Even though he's very confused at the rejection, she firmly tells him that she will not be marrying him, to the distress of her mother and the delight of her father.
Right. And in response, a very flustered Mr. Collins goes and proposes to Elizabeth's best friend, a character we haven't mentioned yet, named Charlotte Lucas. The Lucases are another family who lives in the same neighborhood, the country neighborhood, as the Bennets and are close friends to the Bennets. Originally, Elizabeth isn't super happy about this, but she comes to learn that it's okay, and Charlotte Lucas is looking to secure her future and well-being. But Collins is now satisfied and leaves the county.
So at some point, Jane gets a letter from Caroline Bingley saying that the Bingleys have to leave town and go to London for an unknown period of time. And it's kind of vague reasons why they have to leave and vague estimates of when they'll be back. And this leaves Jane really confused because she thought that they hit it off really well and she was excited to keep seeing him. And now she doesn't know when she'll ever see him again. And he never really said bye. So she's a little bit distraught, and Elizabeth is upset and wondering if Darcy has something to do with all of this. So time passes, and at some point, Liz decides to go visit now Mrs. Collins, formerly Miss Charlotte Lucas. And so they spend time together, and they go and visit Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
So much to Elizabeth's surprise, she's not the only visitor to Lady Catherine. Darcy is there as well, and also his close friend Colonel Fitzwilliams.
Lo and behold, Lady Catherine de Bourgh is Darcy's aunt, Mr. Darcy's aunt. So Elizabeth gets thrust into the company of Darcy once again, and finds more reasons to be upset at him.
Meanwhile, Darcy finds more reasons to like Liz.
Right, just her charming personality and her wit and her not cowing down to Lady Catherine de Bourgh like everyone else seems to do.
So surprisingly, at least to Lizzie, Darcy starts showing up at the home of Mr. Collins, where she is staying, and visiting with her one-on-one. At some point, Colonel Fitz explains to Elizabeth that he thinks that Elizabeth has the wrong impression of Mr. Darcy, and that he is a much more kind-hearted and good friend than she expects him to be. He's just not very good at showing it. And as an example, he says that Mr. Darcy recently saved one of his close friends from making a very inconvenient and what would have been a very damaging marriage.
And Elizabeth figures out that he's referring to Jane and Bingley, but doesn't mention that she's actually connected with the relationship. So this revelation kind of seals it in her mind that, okay, so Darcy really is the reason that Jane and Bingley have been broken up. And then a couple days later, again, while she's alone at the Collins' house,
Darcy proposes. Surprise.
What?
Yeah, no. Liz was super shocked. She did not see this coming at all. And she, not so politely, turns him down, accusing him both of ruining Jane and Bingley's chance at happiness together, as well as ruining her good friend Wickham's career prospects by denying him his inheritance.
Yeah. So Darcy is like, oh, okay, I didn't know that she had this terrible opinion of me. I mean, I know I kind of didn't like her family and stuff, but I was going to marry her anyway. So he leaves kind of shocked at the rejection, which he probably should have seen coming. And then a day or two later, he finds her and gives her a letter without really saying much and just says, please read this. It'll kind of explain everything, and then walks away again.
So this letter does explain practically everything. Darcy owns up to his influence on Bingley in moving him away from Jane, but he gives reasons. But to the further and deeper charge of his offense against Mr. Wickham, Darcy explains the whole story, and it's a bit deeper and more complicated than Elizabeth would have expected.
Right. So, yeah, what ended up happening was kind of the opposite of what Wickham had said, where actually Wickham kind of squandered an inheritance he got from Darcy's father and then kept asking for more money and then tried to elope with Darcy's sister before Darcy found out about it and stopped it. So he's kind of just an all-around bad guy.
Right. He's a complete rogue, a cad. He's just after the money or the inheritance that a woman could bring, and he's
but
not
he
a
has
good fellow
the
to
he has
be
the
around.
personality. He has the personality to charm women into kind of going along with whatever he says.
Correct. So after this, Elizabeth kind of feels like an idiot, but she heads back home anyway.
So after she comes home, she's talking with her aunt and uncle, the Gardners, and they have always wanted to see the estate of Pemberley because remember we're talking about old English mansions and estate grounds and stuff like this. So Pemberley is one of the best ones, and they want to go visit it. And it also happens to be Darcy's home, but they find out from one of the servants at Pemberley that the family is away for the summer. So Elizabeth agrees to go with them and visit Pemberley because she doesn't expect to run into Darcy at all. And guess what? She runs into Darcy and sees him there with his sister, Georgiana, and is totally flustered and tries to run away, but Darcy catches up to her and just wants to talk to her and actually converses with her aunt and uncle. And Elizabeth is pretty surprised at all this because she expected Darcy to be really mad at her for her rejection and being angry at him for stuff that he didn't do or did with really good intentions. So she expects Darcy to not like her at all at this point, whereas her affections are starting to change because she finds out that he's actually been helping her family a lot.
Right, and all of the as her impressions of Darcy start to change, she meets people who have much better impressions of Darcy themselves, such as the staff at Pemberley and Darcy's sister especially, who she strikes up a quick friendship with. And Mr. Bingley and his sister show up again. Mr. Bingley at this point starts asking after Jane. He seems to have realized that maybe Jane was into him after all. However, as up as things are looking, we really don't get to see them follow through at this point. A couple letters arrive from Elizabeth's home from Jane, and there's some pretty bad news. Lydia has eloped with Mr. Wickham.
Bum, bum, bum.
Unfortunately, they haven't married yet.
Yeah, so Elizabeth is reading these letters. Darcy hears about all this and is like, okay, you're pretty upset right now, so I'm going to just go and let you kind of be alone with your emotions and all that. So Elizabeth runs back home to the Bennet's home, which is Longbourn, and is trying to, figure out what's happening. And so the Gardners, her aunt and uncle, end up going down and tracking down Wickham in London. Wickham ends up marrying Lydia, which he wasn't intending to do. He was intending to just kind of use her. But they get legally married because Lydia actually has family that cares about her, and the only way to make this legit is for them to be married, so they won't be the scandal of the neighborhood anymore. As soon as Mrs. Bennet finds out that they are actually legally married, she goes from hysterical to ecstatic that one of her daughters is now successfully married, and she has something she could take pride in. And Lydia and Wickham come back, and all the sisters are kind of throwing shade at Lydia, who is just over the moon excited. Meanwhile, Mr. Bennet and Elizabeth talk about how her uncle, Mr. Gardner, must have paid a fortune to get Wickham to marry her, and they have they're completely at a loss for how they can ever pay back Mr. Gardner for what he did for their family.
Right, and soon through the exchange of a few letters between Elizabeth and her aunt in London, she discovers that it was Mr. Darcy who actually immediately rode to London, tracked down Wickham, offered him money, and forced him to marry Lydia on his own expense.
Right. And shortly after this, The other thing Darcy does is he brings back Bingley to Longbourn, and they visit a couple times, and Jane and Bingley start, even though Jane had thought that she was over him, the flame kindles again, and Bingley proposes, and they get their little happily ever after.
So now one sister is married, another is engaged, and Mr. Darcy's still kind of hanging around. Until one day when the Lady Catherine de Bourgh shows up and accuses Elizabeth of being engaged to Mr. Darcy. And upon finding out that she's not, very rudely I might add, she begs her to promise to never become engaged to Mr. Darcy. And Elizabeth says no to that as well. And the Lady Catherine storms out.
So at some point, they're taking a walk with all the sisters, and they end up on their own, and Elizabeth says, "Thank you for all the stuff you've done for our family, even though I wasn't supposed to know that you're the one who did it." And he says, "Okay, well, you know I did it all for you, so if your feelings have changed, let me know. Otherwise, I'll stop talking about it." And she's like, "Well, my feelings have changed," and they get engaged and happily ever after.
Right.
Oh,
right.
so sweet. All right, so now that we've got an overview of the story, we can start to talk about the movies. And generally, we've been going in kind of the order that the movies were released, but we're going to go a little bit out of order this week because our quote-unquote constant will be the 2005 Pride and Prejudice starring Keira Knightley, because this is the one that is actually tries to hold to the book, and it is in the time period that the book is set.
Right, and our second movie this week is also called Pride and Prejudice, but it's the 2003 version, which was a modern adaptation set in the time period it was produced and released in, the early 2000s, but we do have a very interesting third movie to round it out.
Yeah, our last film was Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which just came out last year in 2016. It is our fantasy version. All right, starting with Pride and Prejudice 2005. Alex, what did you think about this movie?
I absolutely loved this movie. I had... So a bit of background, I have no experience with Pride and Prejudice before, but I listened to the audiobook, and then immediately following, I watched this movie, and I absolutely loved it. I think part of it was because I was in love with the story, but it's also just incredibly well crafted and well acted. They do take some liberties to fit it all into the 2-hour segment. I think they do a lot of combinations in terms of reveals. For instance, when Darcy is revealing his involvement with Wickham and the breakup of Bingley and Jane, it's a little faster paced than it is in the book, but I think the liberties they took don't damage it in any way. What did you think of the way they compressed it?
Yeah, I think they did well. They kept to, the main story that we just gave our overview of. They cut characters who don't have a dramatic impact on the story. They kept all the major ones. There are a lot of characters that they kept, and it can maybe get a little confusing if you're not too familiar with the story, but if you know what you're watching, you can follow along just fine. I noticed there were some things that they, in order for a more visual cinematic experience, they would move certain conversations to a different location or different things just to make it more dramatic. So, for example, the proposal happens at almost this gazebo thing in the rain, just makes it very much more dramatic. They kind of take parts of, I think I found this in each of the versions, is they take parts of the letter and incorporate it into the proposal so that there's a little bit more back and forth between Elizabeth and Darcy at the proposal, because it's kind of one-sided in the book. So that interaction is seen better on film if Darcy pushes back a bit, which is slightly uncharacteristic, but not too much. And And there's another point where Wickham is explaining his sob story to Elizabeth, and they move that outside to under a tree, whereas it was inside while a bunch of people are doing stuff in this room that would just be. It's a lot nicer to see them just kind of hanging out outside instead.
Right. It was a nice way to blend in a more varieties of locations, which gives you a little more variety in the look of the film, and also kind of breaks up the routine sitting room aesthetic that's very constant in the book, and is maybe a little more vivid in the book because you get to make the sitting room in your mind, whereas in a film medium, moving between a sitting room in one scene and then walking along a river in the next scene is a little more visually pleasing to see that back and forth.
Yeah, and it's not uncharacteristic because many of the characters in the book enjoy walking and being
Right.
active. So
That was
the English countryside is a great backdrop for those kinds of scenes.
it's absolutely beautiful. We don't just see that in this movie. We see it in almost all Pride and Prejudice adaptations, except maybe 2003. I think where walking is a there's a lot of things that we don't see in 2003, but
Yeah, we're getting to it just in a second.
we'll hold off on that for now. We're storing it up, but walking it seems to be a big motif. Walking and thinking and kind of maybe crossing that distance between two different viewpoints. It happens a lot, but you see that a lot in this movie, and it's just beautiful. These really wide shots of the English countryside, and actually the whole cinematography across this movie is really impressive. It's the story is pretty much already built. You already have a Pride and Prejudice story. There's a question of how do you adapt that to film, how do you shorten it, but once you cross that, there's a lot of creative energy that you have left over that you can put into how do we shoot this, how do we make this visually interesting, how do we play with the performances to really bring this to life on screen, which I think is one of the advantages that you have coming into working on a adaptation film rather than an original screenplay idea. But especially in this Pride and Prejudice, they do a lot of really beautiful shots. I know you noticed a lot of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things when you're trying to make a film and condense such a spanning novel or any kind of work that spans a lot of time and you have to cram it into 2 hours, how do you show that passage of time is really important. And there are some really cool ways that they do it in this movie. So in the first instance, we have Keira Knightley as Elizabeth Bennet kind of spinning around on this rope swing, and so she twists it up and spins around, but we see her perspective as she's looking between the outside and this barn that they have behind their house, and as she spins we see the seasons changing, so we know that time is elapsing, and it's just kind of a fun thing to do. And there's another time where after she reads the letter and she's contemplating it, we see her just staring in the mirror, and we see the lighting in the room change behind her. Just these cool little visual indications that where we don't have a title card that says 2 weeks later or anything like that.
In the SpongeBob voice?
Yeah, in the SpongeBob voice. Just ways to show us that time is passing without, telling us that time is passing, but showing us.
Yeah, and they can bring a little more meaning. They're very visually stunning and beautiful scenes to watch. I especially love that time lapse after she's gotten Darcy's letter that you're talking about, where we see the sun rise and fall, and then the moon come up, and then Darcy walks in the background. Just through light
and shadows in the room.
Right, and of course there was a little bit of VFX out there, I'm sure, but it was a beautiful shot. But it also brings a little extra meaning, as do all like really complicated cinematographies and shot setups tend to do, to what we're seeing on film. For instance, on the swing shot that you were talking about, she had just heard that her best friend Charlotte accepted a proposal from Mr. Collins.
Right.
And in her swinging around on that swing, she's essentially staying in place as the world turns around her, and we see the time pass around her while she's essentially just hovering there, treading water while everything else moves forward.
Yeah, and I mean, in a more practical light, we're also seeing, okay, so it's been several months now, and her disapproval of the marriage has kind of waned because the next thing that's going to happen is she's going to go visit them.
Yeah, exactly. It definitely bridges that gap really well and keeps it moving. But it's touches like that you really get to play with in these adaptation kind of films. What is the interesting thing that we can bring to this story that's already really great through a film medium, and playing with cinematography is definitely a really great way to do that. And also, of course, I mean, you would experience this in a theater setting too, but casting fantastic actors and actresses,
all around in this
into
one.
their roles. And I'm not just saying that because I might have a tiny bit of a crush on Keira Knightley, but
Well, I don't think we can help it since Parts of the Caribbean came out when we were 8, and when you're going through a pirate phase at 8, that kind of puts you on Keira Knightley's side for life.
true. Although I will say I can't claim that I went through any pirate phase.
Oh, maybe that's just me.
Maybe that's just you. But for sure, I mean, Keira Knightley is fantastic in this. I don't know how exactly she ended up getting pegged as period piece. Like that's like she kept getting cast in those.
Well, she had done. Speaking of Pirates of the Caribbean, she had done that 2 years prior, so she already had some period pieces in her resume.
Right. She's got all of that credit, but it just works. Like she's a really good Elizabeth Bennet, and the tone of the film is not super serious as you might get in the 1995 miniseries, which definitely has a bit of levity in it. It's got a bit of humor, but this one's got this 2005 version has a bit of snap to it, a bit of humor, not only in some of the moments between the characters, but also in the direction and the editing. And you can just see it in the cuts and the transitions where you transition to a scene where they're calling out the Bennet sisters who've arrived at Mr. Bingley's house to visit Jane, and they're like, introducing Miss Bennet, Miss Bennet, Miss Bennet, and Miss Bennet. And then you cut to a shot right there, a perfect square shot of them all four plopping down on the couch in this very funny fashion, and you get to see all of their exaggerated expressions all at once. Which brings like a nice new little life to the story, I think.
Yeah, and just kind of going back a little bit to talking about Keira Knightley, I think one of the things that she brings to this is she's one of those actors who you can see what she's thinking in her face. Like, even if she's not talking, she expresses so much through her face. There's other actors who do this, like Martin Freeman, but it's such a great quality to be able to like see the gears turning in your character's head, especially on a book adaptation where in the book you get the writer's narration to tell you what's happening in their head, and that's really the hardest part of adapting to film, is that thought process. So when an actor can kind of just show that without saying anything, it's a great asset. And then we've got, I mean, Darcy was cast great. Bingley and the mother and father they're just kind of exactly what you picture in your head when you're reading the book. And then we've got, for Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Judi Dench, undeniably
fantastic. Great. And her hair was amazing. It was ridiculous, but it was amazing.
All the costume and art design was great as well.
Right. I mean, that's part of the fun of the period piece film that's already been done so much. I mean, there's a lot of Pride and Prejudice adaptations. I know both you and I watched a lot of them this week, but there's even more than what we got through.
Oh yeah.
We
I mean,
watched
dating
more than
back
just
to
the three movies we're
1940.
talking about.
Yeah, dating back to 1940 with Laurence Olivier, which I actually watched that one, and there's some big hats and big hair in that movie too. But it's fun to see it like all put together in color and with the modern kind of sleekness to it that this movie has.
Right, right. And I just want to ask you like a really quick overall question, maybe. Have you yet to see a Mr. Darcy you don't like? Because I've always found
That's a good question. They've all been cast pretty well so far.
I think we just get such a good idea of the character, this tragically misunderstood nice guy who, you know, is just like this guy who you really want to like by the end of the movie, but's all, you know, sullen and stocky. Like he's almost like a romance cliche. And I don't know whether that came from this story. Like my romance history is not super up to date.
I'm sure Jane Austen in general had an influence on our current idea of romance cliches, the original.
Oh, I'm sure. You know, I mean, just this and Sense and Sensibility, and there's so many that just kind of set the tone for it. But I definitely love all of the Darcys that we saw this week, and I would be willing to say that this is the best Elizabeth Bennet, especially
Yeah, I would say so.
especially out of the three movies that we're talking about.
Right. She has the brightness, the quickness that we hear about in the book. She's very, sharp and fun, but also can be cynical and condescending.
Right. She's good at pulling out those flaws.
She always has a lightness even when she's being critical.
Right. And it's not one of the things that I've realized more and more as we've dove more into the story over the week is how subjective the entire story is to Elizabeth's point of view. So, maybe the reason that the mom seems so annoying is that she's that annoying to Elizabeth. So that's how she comes across in the book. So the way that Elizabeth is played doesn't just influence her own part, it influences all the parts rather dramatically.
Yeah. So let's jump back 2 years and also forward about a century and talk about Pride and Prejudice 2003, starring Cam Heskin and Orlando Seal. This is a very different film.
Very different film.
It's the same story, essentially, but extremely different in approach and execution.
Right, and I think we should start with addressing the approach to the adaptation, because while we saw in 2005 Pride and Prejudice that it was trying to be as true to the book as possible, it was actually set in the period. This one is not. This one is set in 2003 Utah for reasons, with a modern, I guess it's a bit dated by now, but a modern cast dealing with modern problems, which is an interesting take, not only to see it translated to our current, style and setting, but also trying to translate the story that deals with very old values
and social conventions.
And trying to move it up to a modern day theme,
which is much more casual, and so it's
right.
a little bit more of a challenge, but
yeah. So we're definitely not saying that this is an easy attempt. Right. Or we're not saying that this is an easy thing to attempt at all.
Let's talk a little bit about, just start off with plot changes, because there were some things that changed. Actually, a lot of things that changed.
There were a lot of things that changed.
They tried to keep the gist of the arc. So to start off, all of the girls, there are still all the 5 girls, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia.
We keep the majority of the main characters, except for the parents, because the sisters are no longer sisters, except for Kitty and Lydia, who are sisters. They are grad students who are living together in a house owned by Lydia's parents, and they are all trying to make it in the world, I guess. It's not super clearly explained. Our main character, Elizabeth, is a graduate student going for her degree and trying to get her novel of sorts published. Her best friend and former college roommate is Jane, who, if you remember from the main story, is the big sister and the prettiest of the sisters. She is a transfer student from Argentina, who now lives in America. Mary is still the shy, recluse bookworm, and Kitty and Lydia are still boy crazy. But Lydia has a much more domineering relationship with Kitty. She definitely like controls Kitty and makes her do things along with her. Maybe not necessarily in like a malicious sense, but definitely in a self-serving sense.
Actually, sometimes in a malicious sense. I don't really know exactly why they do some of the things they do, like cutting the power at a party. Anyway.
Yeah.
So we've got other changes, like letters become emails because it's the early 2000s, so texting isn't a big thing, but emails are. And then we've got some plot changes, like Mary ends up marrying Collins and not Elizabeth's friend Charlotte. We've got, what else? I think those are some. Oh, so talking about the ending, we have Wickham and Lydia run away to Vegas to get married, and at the end, Wickham gets arrested and stuff, and
he gets arrested on outstanding.
Yeah, I don't even know exactly what he got arrested for.
So the other four characters who play big parts. Number one is Mr. Collins, who is still in the film, still in the story, and he's definitely trying to pursue Elizabeth. However, he gets stolen away almost by Mary, and those two end up going out. Then we still have Darcy, who is, instead of a rich heir of an estate in England, he is the rich CEO of a company in California that he inherited from his father.
A book publishing company, conveniently for our writer protagonist.
Exactly. He is still friends with Bingley, who is not very smart, and by not very smart, I mean they made him a total idiot. He's
not
definitely
sure why.
a rich kid. He is devoted to his entrepreneurial pursuit of developing music tracks to make dogs smarter.
Which basically just means taking Mozart and playing it on extremely high dog whistle notes that you then let your dog listen to. Except for sometimes it makes German Shepherds incredibly violent, which actually is important, believe it or not.
To the plot. Yes, right. Yes, it is. And then our final character who they keep in is Caroline, who is Bingley's sister and is extra manipulative in this version in her pursuit of Darcy and her attempts to keep both Jane and Elizabeth away from Bingley and Darcy, respectively.
And then we also have Wickham, who just looks really sleazy and is constantly having Elizabeth like pay for stuff for him, and is not so subtly kind of the D-bag character.
Right. And he's an outright criminal. He doesn't just gamble. He is arrested for, I believe, petty theft and outstanding debts of some sort at the end. Except I don't think you can be arrested for outstanding debts anymore because debtor prison is illegal. I don't know. But
he gets arrested after taking Lydia to get married in Vegas, and then the the officiant in Vegas, quote, lots of quotes on officiant in Vegas. It's like, haven't you been here before? And then Darcy comes in and saves the day, and there's a brawl, and Bingley plays his music for the cop's German Shepherd and goes crazy. I don't know what happened at the end of this movie. It kind of all blew up.
So the most interesting thing about modern adaptations, or any adaptation that tries to move from one time period to another time period that's far enough away to have social values and social conventions shift between time period A and time period B, is seeing the changes that they make to adapt to the new social setting, but also how to make those changes but stay true to the themes and the storyline and the message of the original work, which is the lasting quality of the work. Definitely in Pride and Prejudice, the period aspects of it are interesting, but what really keeps us interested, I think, century after century, and it has been a couple centuries by now, is that is watching this love story play out, and misjudging people and so on and so forth. And we could talk about that more if we had a book podcast, but we have a movie podcast. So we're talking about how this 2003 film at least tried to adapt these characters to a modern setting, but I'm not sure that they did that very well. What do you think, Jonathan?
Yeah, there's definitely some kind of essentials that they missed or didn't, or got lost in the translation somehow. So one of probably the first biggest weakness is taking away the family aspect, because the fact that these are all sisters and that Darcy disapproves of the family is a really big element in why Elizabeth feels so hurt whenever he reproves her family. And in this, they're all just friends, so there's not really a like that blood connection there. And we don't even know why they're friends with some of these people. Like, Mary is so awkward and so different from the rest, and it's never quite explained why she's part of the group. And then there's a point where Darcy is giving criticism on her book because he's this part of this publishing company that's considering it for review, and she didn't know that he was the one who would be reviewing it. But as he's criticizing her book, she's kind of totally rejecting all of his criticism and feeling hurt by it. But it's not the same comparison as when Darcy criticizes her family in the book, because you actually have kind of a lifelong connection to your family, whereas you're actually supposed to take constructive criticism on your creative work, especially from a publishing company who can put your book out there. He wasn't like trying to change the entire story. He was just giving her actual constructive criticism, and she shut him down just because she doesn't like him.
Another character who kind of fell from grace, so to speak, in this 2003 version is Mr. Collins, who, while maybe not a fan favorite, unless you count the Matt Smith rendition in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, but we're not quite there yet.
Which we'll get to in a second, yeah.
Mr. Collins in the book is a super important character because marrying him, if one of the sisters were to marry him, it would mean future security for all five sisters. All five sisters would be able to retain their house after the death of their father at some point in the future. But by rejecting him, Lizzie more or less guarantees that when their father dies, they lose the house. And then all the rest of the family that's remaining will be destitute. But in the 2003 movie, Mr. Collins is just kind of an annoying guy who's trying to marry Lizzie for random reasons, random unclear reasons.
Yeah, he's this kind of super religious character who, what in what feels like extremely outdated style, is kind of stuck on this idea of we have to marry and procreate and fill the earth and all this kind of stuff, which feels very shoehorned in this movie because none of the other characters are like that.
Right, and in the original, Mr. Collins wasn't even that overtly religious of a character. I mean, he was the parson of a parish, but he doesn't
much more
seem
concerned with Lady Catherine than the fact that he needs to marry for religious reasons. It was mostly because he's so obsessed with his patron, and she was like, you should get married. You know that?
Right. There's even a point where he's asked whether or not dancing might be offensive to his religious values, and proving that he's not a character in Footloose, he says, "No, I love dancing."
Right.
But yeah, they just kind of made that character really sad. So another interesting way to look at a modern adaptation rather than a period adaptation is the techniques, because the techniques that you might use in a period piece would probably differ from a modern adaptation. You tend to see more techniques that would define it as that year's modern adaptation. So if this adaptation is a 2003 adaptation, so there would probably be an urge to see 2003 techniques be prevalent in that modern adaptation to, define it as modern rather than period. And you do see that in this movie. Again, maybe it doesn't work. And by maybe I'm saying it doesn't work, but there's quite a few. Kicking off from the start, there's just so many montages.
Yeah.
So many.
You're gonna need a montage. And they are not shy about
song.
They are not shy about their montages with the pop rock music and driving from one place to another that is just overused in so many movies of all genres. But this one is just
starting off the movie with not just a montage, but a getting ready for your day montage is so 1990s, 2000s mid-budget filmmaking. It's ridiculous. It's exactly what I expected to see at the start of this movie before I watched it, and it was.
Yeah, and then there are other things like there are constant flashbacks with really funky colorizations done to them and daydreams that's supposed to shock you, and then, oh, nope, that was just in her head. Which I get that she's a writer, but that's also a cliche of writer characters and, creative characters that are always daydreaming and then psych, that didn't actually happen, but is not pulled off nearly so well as in movies like The Secret Life of Walter Mitty that kind of hinge around that. These are just kind of thrown in there randomly just for fun.
Right. And the weird thing is that a lot of these techniques are meant to make it feel modern, but that also sometimes means that the film doesn't age that well, and I really think this one doesn't. Like, you can look at it and you could definitely be like, I feel like that was made sometime between 2000 and 2005.
Right.
It just feels like that kind of movie. It feels dated and a bit old, and maybe it didn't age so well, because I know both you and I saw some mixed to favorable reviews from 2003 on it, but definitely
so we
looking at
can't
it
say
now,
how it stacked up with other modern romance movies that were coming out at the same time, but looking back on it, it doesn't hold up terribly well.
No, it really doesn't. Which is why we're not going to talk about it anymore. Instead, we're going to talk about zombies.
Yeah, so this is a modern creation set in a period time with a fantastical element, and it's just kind of a lot of fun. I was kind of expecting to... I had a little bit of a Pride and Prejudice moment with this film where I was expecting to go into it and be very condescending about it, but it kind of won me over pretty quickly because it's It's Pride
I
and
showed
Prejudice.
your prejudice against that movie.
I know, that's what I'm saying. It was definitely an Elizabeth and Darcy, and I was very Darcy going into this movie, but it won me over.
It's definitely not it's definitely not high art of any kind. It's not, a super artsy film. It's just a really fun movie. And because it's a Pride and Prejudice adaptation with a flair, it kind of feels like this fandom. It's hard to say that it's fan fiction because it's a movie now, but 50 Shades of Grey is also a movie now, so I think that's out the window. But it is kind of fan fiction. It's like, what if that really great love story with Elizabeth Bennet and William Darcy had zombies?
Right, and it's not a matter of diminishing the love story. It's just a matter of throwing in a side zombie storyline. I mean, that's literally what it follows. All the same plot beats until maybe the very end. There's so yeah, we'll just kind of talk about the changes real quick. We start off. This isn't a movie where we see a zombie outbreak. We start in the middle of a war with zombies, and during the
that's been going on for like 100 years.
Yeah, and there's a super great title sequence where we see this pop-up book explaining, giving us our exposition of how the zombies came to be and how they protected London, how they fortified London with a big wall and a moat and all this stuff. So it gives us all the information really quickly at the beginning, and then we can jump straight into the Bennet sisters, going through their daily routine, but their daily routine just happens to include muskets and dagger cleaning, which is just fun. Knowing the original material makes every part of this movie a lot more fun to watch.
Right. It's definitely one of those movies where it would be almost weird to watch it without knowing the Pride and Prejudice story, but it's really fun with it. And they follow that story almost for the most part up until the very end. Like you said, it's just that while they're doing all the things associated with the story, they have to be like wary of zombies at the same time. So they're going to there's one point where Mr. Collins and the girls are going to visit their friends in town, and they're talking, and Mr. Collins is being a bit annoying, but they have to stop and kill some zombies first. Or Jane is sent over to Mr. Bingley's house by her mom, and instead of getting sick on the way to the house, she's attacked by zombies on the way to the house, and she's held in quarantine at Mr. Bingley's house to make sure that she won't turn into a zombie. Which is really entertaining, because after you watch so many Pride and Prejudice adaptations in a row, it's nice to see something that's, really fresh, like not just fresh, but it's pretty funky. But
right, without condescending the source material at all. I mean, they use literal I mean, there are some great moments where they have literal dialogue from the books, and then they throw in zombie talk. So there's a point in the book where Mr. Darcy is talking about all the things that a woman needs to be considered accomplished in his books. She needs to be well-read. She needs to know all the languages. She needs to know how to knit or play piano or whatever. And then in the zombie version, he throws in, and she also needs to be versed in all of the fighting styles of killing zombies. And it's just like, but the language stays the same. The language isn't modernized. It's just laced with zombie killing intrigue.
Right. And I like that it's not over the top zombies like Day of the Dead level zombies, where the zombies kind of consume the narrative. Like there's definitely zombie puns. It's where the zombies just add flavor and another storyline to the narrative. They don't become the only storyline. They are an additional storyline that eventually at the end becomes a very large one and has to be resolved, but not without dominating the love story. The love story between Elizabeth Bennet, who's this super well-trained badass living in the country outside of London with her family, and this colonel in charge of lots of zombie killing, William Darcy, that still takes centerpiece and kind of drives the plot. There's just also zombies driving the plot.
Yeah, and there's another kind of fun thing that they do where, so in filmmaking, there's a phrase that's like, every scene is a conflict, or every scene needs to have a conflict. And in this film, all of the important conversations, like Darcy's proposal and Elizabeth's rejection, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh's interrogation of Elizabeth when she finds out that they're going to be engaged, are all turned into literal fights. So once Elizabeth rejects Darcy and starts explaining her reasons, she's throwing books at him, and then there's like punching each other and rolling around the room and grappling and all this kinds of stuff. And it's ridiculous, but it's fun because we know that there's the tension there, and now they're extremely well-trained fighters, so they can express that in a much more physical way.
Right, you're taking the verbal sparring that was so interesting in the original material and replacing it with just literal sparring, which that kind of like replacement is what's so fun with this really out of the box kind of style adaptation, where you already like the source material. You're like, wouldn't that be great? But what if when Darcy proposes, Elizabeth gets really mad and tries to kill him? Wouldn't that be an interesting scene to watch? And just watching the change from the original material to the new material, the new adaptation, is just what makes this movie so fun, because that change is just so ridiculous.
Right, because instead of watching a new movie and being like, oh man, I don't know what's going to happen, you're thinking, okay, so I think I know what's going to happen, but how are they going to make it more interesting? And maybe a zombie will show up randomly and they have to kill it while they're in the middle of their card game or whatever.
Exactly. And we keep talking about these zombies, but we haven't really explained what the zombie plot is to the film, besides the fact that they've mostly taken over England, except for this bubble around London and London itself. So do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll get into a little bit, but we don't need to get too deep into it. People who can watch it can still not get too spoiled by it. So basically we find out that their zombies, once bitten, are not completely, brain thirsty zombies until they have eaten their first human brain. Until then, they're still pretty civil, and you can't really tell that they're zombies. They still look kind of normal. But as soon as they eat a human brain, their flesh starts melting off, and they turn into like the zombies that we know. But some of the zombies have found a way to kind of maintain their more human qualities by eating pigs' brains instead of human brains. So it kind of dissipates their hunger and doesn't turn them into killing monsters. But there's some other things thrown in there with like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that come and signal the end times and stuff. And this is actually one of the problems that I have with the movie, which I'm not going to...
They never explain the 4 horsemen, do they?
Right, that's what I was about to say, is that the film is almost like the zombie plot isn't totally resolved. So it's either setting up for a sequel or it's just really poorly wrapped up.
Right. They never... They resolve our individual characters' plot at the end, but they never give us a hint to the greater stakes of whether or not England will ever survive, which is only really a question. I mean, it would definitely be believable if they ended the movie with these 2 characters falling in love and still just managing to survive in a world that's been completely taken over by zombies. But they hint at a greater plot with these 4 horsemen.
And they hint at an antichrist and a giant battle and all these things that we don't actually see. So I'm actually wondering if they will do a sequel. But if not, then it really does kind of fall. The Pride and Prejudice storyline wraps up fine, but the
zombie plot maybe leaves something to be desired. Let's talk about overall our overall notes.
So, I mean, we both love this story, so we can see why it's been, retold so many times and in so many different ways. And I mean, this goes for a lot of great literature like Sherlock and Dracula and Frankenstein and all these things that you've seen so many adaptations of just because they're in the public domain and they've stood the test of time. And so people are always going to love these stories. And there's certain things that we've noticed that kind of stay the same in these adaptations that they're not something that you have to keep to according to the book or anything, and they're really small things, but it's really interesting to see how they carry over. For example, hair colors. Almost every adaptation we saw this week, Jane had blonde hair, right? Or some kind of light colored hair.
Jane, that actually shocked me a lot because I didn't picture Jane as being blonde in the book. I don't know, maybe they mentioned that and I missed it, but everyone cast Jane as blonde.
And in the same way, every single version we saw, Darcy has really dark hair, brown or black hair, and Bingley has some kind of light hair, usually red or maybe blonde.
Right. These little extraneous points that almost become canon because they've just been referenced so much by each adaptation. I mean, you can just tell, like, looking at Colin Firth, Mr. Darcy, how much that's impacted the casting of every Mr. Darcy since then.
Absolutely. And, another point is Mary has glasses in every single version. There's not a version where Mary does not have glasses.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think that was specified in the book, but you think of her character as the nerdy, only reads and plays piano and is moralizing all the time. And so, what do those kind of people have? They have glasses.
Yeah, and they also, because Mary is described as being the only Bennet sister to have the misfortune of being plain in the book, they always have to give her very either downplayed or just straight up negative makeup where they put a couple extra moles on her face and just
or pimples or whatever.
Right. They just like try to make her look bad, which, always makes me feel bad for Mary.
Yeah, she is kind of sympathetic in a lot of the versions, but
yeah, everyone always rags on her, man.
Yeah, and we also noticed that for the most part, these abbreviated film versions keep most of the same plot points. So you get the party at the beginning where Elizabeth overhears disparaging comments against her. You get the visit to Bingley's house, although that's not quite as played up in the 2003 version, I don't think.
No, it's not.
You get the proposal and rejection, the running into Darcy randomly, Wickham elopes with Lydia, just the really big ones, but they all seem to pick up on the same major pieces without too much variation. Like there isn't a lot of taking liberties with what the characters do. It's just a matter of how it's presented.
Right. And that's, it goes beyond just referencing the same material from the book, but also referencing each adaptation over and over, which becomes, weirdly enough, this way to redefine what's truly important in the book. Because, if a certain plot point is always kept and a certain plot point is always cut by each adaptation, that influences what the next adaptation might cut and keep, and in turn, what might be interpreted as important and not important by fans of Pride and Prejudice, and fans of the book and other adaptations.
So there's actually something interesting that I noticed that I was wondering if you picked up on, is the fact that especially the Pride and Prejudice and Zombie version, which is the newest version, so it has all of these other versions that we're talking about to draw from, but it actually pulled dialogue from the 2005 version that isn't in the book, but it was almost the same thing. So Darcy accuses Jane of not showing her feelings or not expressing her feelings, and And Elizabeth says, that's because she's shy. And that was not in the book, but they both said that in 2005 in Prejudice and Zombies.
I totally noticed that. It was. I think that was one of those moments where I realized that these works are not just adapting from the book in 1813. It's also adapting from all of the other versions. You know, the 1940 film with Laurence Olivier, and the 1995 miniseries with Colin Firth, and so on and so forth, and also to some extent the 2012, 2013 YouTube series, the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which is a fantastic modern adaptation, by the way. I have to recommend that. If you're looking for a modern adaptation out there, the Lizzie Bennet Diaries is a much better adaptation than the 2003 movie.
Yeah, so talking about other adaptations that we didn't cover in the film portion of the podcast, we have the 1995 BBC miniseries with Colin Firth. This is probably the truest to the book version out of any that we've seen, and we've seen all the ones that, I mean, you can actually find somewhere. There are a couple other miniseries that have kind of been kind of forgotten, I guess. Right.
And there's a Chinese TV show adaptation, which obviously we couldn't get our hands on, but
there's also the 1940 Pride and Prejudice adaptation with which was adapted by Aldous Huxley, curiously enough, which stars Laurence Olivier. And it's a very interesting golden era look at the story. There's some changes in there, such as Lady Catherine is kind of stripped of her antagonism in some ways, and they take some more liberties with the story while keeping to those main plot points that we talked about. And then the second newest version, besides the zombie adaptation, is, like we said, the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which you can find on YouTube, presented by Pemberley Digital, which is a fun site that we just learned about, which has been kind of adapting some classic work into modern web series. So, for example, the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, it's basically told from the point of view of Elizabeth Bennet creating a vlog series, and she just kind of talks about her life. So we see the whole story kind of evolving around her through her little external monologues, her soliloquies to the camera.
Right. I think that version does a really good job of capturing the kind of like subjective, flawed narrator aspect of the Pride and Prejudice story.
So the last thing I want to talk about is just kind of the way we can see the changing demographic, which I hinted at a little bit earlier, between 2003 and 2016. 2003 and the late 90s, early 2000s were kind of a golden era for rom-coms and fun little quirky romance stories, I feel like. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are a lot of classic rom-coms that came out in that era.
I think it was definitely a strong period for that.
And I mean, there still are, but there always are. And whereas in current times, after the popularity of Twilight and a lot of these other zombie movies that aren't strictly horror, but now zombies can be incorporated into other genres, we kind of see the shift of people's interest from the cliche drenched, cheesy, just straight romance, girl meets guy, all this kind of stuff, to now the girl has to be a badass just as much as the guy does. And
girl meets guy
fighting
meets
monsters.
Zombie.
Yeah, meets zombie. Girl meets guy meets zombie. Zombie loses head.
Oh my, so many zombies.
So it'll be interesting to see what audiences in search of a romance story are going to be looking for in the future, and what other kinds of elements might be incorporated into Pride and Prejudice and other classic literature to quote unquote keep it up to date, even though of course the 2005 version, which is set in the period, is still just as charming as any of the versions, more so in fact.
Right. Right, and you're right. We will be seeing plenty more adaptations of Pride and Prejudice and all of these classic stories where, of course, nobody has to pay a copyright fee on it. So we will definitely be seeing more adaptations of it, and it'll be very interesting to chart the public taste and public interest in rom-coms through those adaptations almost as we move forward in time.
Speaking of changing adaptations, let's start talking about next week, because next week is all about adaptations and how audience expectation changes.
Right. And we're tackling a more
amorphous story.
Yeah, let's go with that. We're tackling with a less well defined story, but it's one that I think most people in America, if not the entire world, know fairly well, and that is the story of Batman. But it's not just our first Batman week; it's our first guest week, which we're really excited about.
Yeah, next week we are going to have on a good friend of mine named Aaron Johnson, who I met in college, and he is a giant comic book fan, and he said that he would like to talk about the different reboots of Batman that we've gotten for many years, starting with 1966 Batman the Movie, starring Adam West. Classic. That one's going to be a lot of fun.
And then, of course, the 1989 Batman Tim Burton reboot, which is in many ways a classic in its own right. That's inspired a lot of modern day superhero filmmaking.
Yep. And just when we thought that 89 was dark and gritty, along comes Christopher Nolan with Batman Begins, and our third film, a kickoff to the modern era of dark and gritty superhero movies, culminating in the last film. Yes, we're doing 4 movies this week. Bear with us. It's a special week.
Right, and I think it's easy enough for all of us to follow along because I think we all know at least a little something about Batman. And regardless of the highly contested mixed reviews out there among the comic book fan world, we will be watching and reviewing Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice by Zack Snyder. And it was released just last year in 2016, and it was the darker and the grittier reboot.
Yeah, so we're trying to capture the first film of each rebooted franchise, or at least the major ones, since 1966. So Batman vs. Superman kicks off the Batfleck and all the movies that are going to be coming out in the future with Justice League and all that stuff.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions or want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at jssatchel.wordpress.com/blog.
Talk to you next week. Happy Valentine's Day.
All right, see ya. Happy Valentine's Day.